June, Pinecreek County Courthouse. The air buzzed with quiet disbelief as 17-year-old Ruby French flipped her hair, smiled faintly, and waited for the jury to return. Her confidence looked unbreakable, like someone auditioning, not defending. She had sold her performance perfectly, the tragedy of a bright, frightened girl who only struck back out of panic. Reporters called her composed beyond her years. The jury met her gaze in pity. Ruby always knew how to fill a silence. But what Ruby did not know, what would destroy her mid-smirk, was waiting on the judge's tablet. A freshly decrypted archive, line after line, of everything she had tried to erase. The teasing, the plotting, the pride. When the judge began to read, truth replaced performance. Every deleted word became a confession, every emoji a blade. The crowd that once admired her calm stared in stunned silence. By the time the final text echoed through the courtroom, "They will all believe me," with a smiley face. Ruby French finally understood. You can delete a message, but not the fingerprints it leaves behind. The Pinecreek County Courthouse stood at the edge of the small Oregon town, a modern building of glass and steel that reflected the surrounding pine forests. Inside, the main courtroom was designed with clean lines and natural light, a space meant to convey transparency and fairness. On this humid June morning, every seat was filled. The case had gripped the community with shocking intensity. A 17-year-old girl accused of killing a classmate. The victim, Sophie Chen, had been 16, a brilliant student with a future that had been stolen in a single, violent moment. Ruby French sat at the defense table in her orange jumpsuit, the white undershirt visible at the collar. She had managed to style her dark brown hair into soft waves that framed her face, and she wore minimal makeup that made her look younger, more vulnerable. Her attorney, a woman named Patricia Voss in her early 50s with carefully styled grey hair and expensive glasses, sat beside her reviewing notes. Voss was a high-priced defense attorney from Portland, hired by Ruby's wealthy parents who owned a successful tech company. Ruby surveyed the courtroom with barely concealed satisfaction. She knew the cameras were positioned at the back of the gallery, knew which angles would capture her best. When a reporter in the third row lifted his phone slightly to snap a photo, Ruby tilted her head down and to the side, letting her hair fall forward in a way that made her look contemplative and sad. Then she whispered to Voss, loud enough for the nearest juror to hear, "Smile when they say my name." Judge Eleanor Harron entered through the side door, her black robes flowing as she ascended to the bench. Harron was a woman in her mid-60s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and sharp grey eyes that had presided over criminal cases for 25 years. She had seen every kind of defendant, from the genuinely remorseful to the calculatingly manipulative. As she looked down at Ruby French, she felt a familiar unease. This girl was performing, and she was very good at it. The clerk called the court to order and read the charges. Ruby French, you are charged with manslaughter in the death of Sophie Marie Chen. How do you plead? Ruby stood slowly, her movements graceful and practiced. Not guilty, Your Honor. Her voice was soft, trembling just slightly. She paused, then added, Sophie was my friend. What happened was a terrible accident. I wish I could take it back. The words hung in the air, perfectly calibrated for maximum sympathy. Judge Harron studied Ruby for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The plea is entered. She set a trial date and addressed the attorneys regarding preliminary motions. At the prosecution table sat Marcus Finn, the district attorney for Pinecreek County. Finn was a man in his late 40s with graying temples and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much injustice. He had reviewed the evidence in this case dozens of times, and each reading had deepened his conviction that Ruby French was not the victim she pretended to be. She was something far more dangerous. She was a narcissist who believed her intelligence and charm made her untouchable. Finn's co-counsel, a younger attorney named Jesse Park, leaned over and whispered, "She is playing us like a script." Finn nodded grimly. "I know. But we have the evidence. We just need to get it in front of the jury." The investigation had begun on a cold afternoon in late March, when Sophie Chen had been found dead behind the gymnasium at Pinecreek High School. The initial call had come from another student who had discovered Sophie lying on the concrete, blood pooling beneath her head. By the time paramedics arrived, Sophie was gone. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with her head striking the concrete after a fall. Ruby French had been found sitting on the ground nearby, her hands covered in blood, crying hysterically. She told the first responders that she and Sophie had been arguing, that the argument had gotten heated, that Sophie had lunged at her and Ruby had pushed her away in self-defense. Sophie had lost her balance and fallen, hitting her head on the concrete. Ruby had tried to help her, had called for help, but it was too late. The story was tragic, but plausible. Two teenage girls, an argument that escalated, a terrible accident. The school community rallied around Ruby, this poor girl who had been involved in such a horrible event. Counselors were brought in to help her process the trauma. Her friends surrounded her with support. But Detective Lorna Price had questions. Price was a veteran investigator in her early 50s, with short dark hair and the relentless instinct of someone who trusted evidence over emotion. She had arrived at the scene and immediately began documenting everything: the position of Sophie's body, the blood spatter pattern, the location where Ruby had been sitting, and most importantly, the injuries on both girls. Sophie's injuries were extensive: a massive skull fracture, defensive wounds on her arms, bruising on her torso. Ruby's injuries were minimal: a small scratch on her forearm, some redness on her palms. The disproportion troubled Price. If this had been a mutual fight that ended accidentally, both girls should have shown more comparable injuries. Price requested a detailed autopsy. The medical examiner, Dr. James Carlson, spent hours examining Sophie's body. His findings were troubling. The skull fracture was severe, the kind that required significant force. But the pattern of the injury suggested Sophie had been on the ground when her head struck the concrete, not standing and falling. There were also indications of multiple impacts, not a single fall. Dr. Carlson called Price personally. This was not a simple accident. The injury pattern suggests Sophie was pushed or thrown to the ground with considerable force, possibly while already off balance. And the multiple impact points suggest her head may have been struck against the concrete more than once. Price returned to Pinecreek High School and conducted a more thorough examination of the scene. She found blood evidence that supported the medical examiner's theory. There were multiple impact sites, suggesting Sophie's head had struck the ground in at least 2 different locations. That was not consistent with a single fall from a standing position. Price requested a warrant to search Ruby's belongings, including her phone. What she found there would become the foundation of the prosecution's case, but it would take months of forensic work to recover it all. Ruby's phone was a late-model smartphone with extensive cloud backup features. When Price examined the device, she found that Ruby had been using it normally in the hours after Sophie's death, texting friends, posting on social media, even taking selfies. But forensic analysis revealed something strange. A large batch of text messages had been deleted from the phone, approximately 15 minutes after Sophie's death, deleted while Ruby was still at the scene, waiting for police to arrive. The deletion was sophisticated. Ruby had not simply deleted individual messages from her messaging app. She had used a third-party application designed to permanently erase data from the device. But what Ruby had not known was that her phone automatically backed up all text messages to a cloud server every 6 hours. The messages she had deleted at the scene had already been backed up earlier that day. And with a warrant, Price could access that backup. The forensic recovery process took weeks. The State Police Digital Crimes Unit worked with the phone's manufacturer to access the cloud backup associated with Ruby's account. What they recovered was devastating. Dozens of text messages that Ruby had sent in the days and hours before Sophie's death. Messages that told a very different story than the one Ruby had been selling to investigators and the public. The trial began on a Monday in early June. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. The case had attracted regional media attention. A beautiful, accomplished teenage girl accused of killing her classmate. The story had all the elements that drew public fascination. Ruby entered the courtroom with her head held high, her posture perfect. She had been allowed to wear a simple silver necklace for the trial, and she touched it frequently, a gesture that seemed to convey vulnerability and loss. As she took her seat beside Patricia Voss, she glanced toward the jury and offered a small, sad smile. Judge Harron called the court to order, and the jury was brought in. 12 citizens of Pinecreek County, selected after 3 days of voir dire. Finn had worked hard to seat jurors who could look past Ruby's youth and charm and focus on evidence. He had succeeded in assembling a group that seemed capable of doing exactly that, though several jurors had already shown visible sympathy toward Ruby during jury selection. Finn stood to deliver his opening statement. He walked slowly to the jury box, his expression serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a young woman who believed she was smarter than everyone around her. Ruby French thought she could commit murder, delete the evidence, and charm her way to freedom. She thought that if she cried at the right moments and said the right words, no one would question her story. But what Ruby did not account for was the permanence of digital evidence. You cannot delete the truth. And the truth, as you will see, is that Ruby French planned Sophie Chen's death, executed that plan, and then tried to cover it up with a performance worthy of an award. Finn outlined the evidence the state would present. The autopsy findings that contradicted the accident story. The deleted text messages that showed premeditation and motive. The witness testimony that would reveal Ruby's jealousy and rage. And the forensic timeline that proved Ruby had been deleting evidence even as she pretended to be a traumatized witness. Patricia Voss delivered the defense opening with polished confidence. She painted Ruby as a bright, sensitive girl who had been involved in a tragic accident and was now being prosecuted because the community needed someone to blame. The text messages, Voss promised, were being taken out of context. Ruby and Sophie had a complicated friendship, with lots of joking and dramatic language that teenagers used. The deletion of messages was simply Ruby trying to protect her privacy during a traumatic time. And the injuries, Voss argued, were entirely consistent with a fall during a heated confrontation. Ruby sat at the defense table with a tissue in her hand, dabbing at her eyes periodically. When Voss mentioned Sophie's name, Ruby's face crumpled and she covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. Several jurors watched her with obvious sympathy. But Judge Harron was watching too, and she noticed something the jurors might have missed. When Ruby thought no one was looking directly at her, her expression would shift. The tears would stop. A small, satisfied smile would flicker across her face before she caught herself and resumed the performance. It was subtle, but it was there. The prosecution's first witnesses established the basic facts. The student who had found Sophie's body described the scene, the blood, the stillness. A paramedic testified about arriving too late, about Ruby sitting nearby, covered in blood, about how composed Ruby had seemed, despite claiming to be in shock. Then came the difficult testimony. Dr. James Carlson took the stand and walked the jury through the autopsy findings. He used diagrams and photographs, careful to balance clinical detail with sensitivity to Sophie's family, who sat in the front row of the gallery. Dr. Carlson explained the nature of Sophie's head injury. The skull fracture was severe. The pattern of the fracture indicated a forceful impact with the concrete surface. But critically, the angle of the fracture suggested Sophie's head had been moving downward when it struck the ground, consistent with being pushed or thrown rather than simply falling. Finn asked, "Dr. Carlson, in your professional opinion, could this injury have been caused by Sophie simply losing her balance during an argument?" Dr. Carlson shook his head. "It is extremely unlikely. The force required to cause this injury suggests a deliberate action. Additionally, there is evidence of multiple impacts, which is not consistent with a single accidental fall." Voss cross-examined aggressively, trying to create doubt about the medical conclusions. But Dr. Carlson was unshakable. He had performed hundreds of autopsies, and the evidence in this case was clear. The emotional center of the early testimony came when Sophie's mother, Grace Chen, took the stand. She was a woman in her mid-40s with dark hair and eyes swollen from months of crying. She spoke slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Finn asked her to describe Sophie's relationship with Ruby. They had been friends since middle school, Grace said. Sophie always spoke highly of Ruby. She admired Ruby's confidence. But in the last few months, Sophie said, Ruby had been acting different, more competitive, more cruel. "Can you elaborate?" Grace nodded, wiping her eyes. Sophie had been selected as a finalist for the Cascade Scholarship, a full ride to any Oregon university. It was a huge honor. Only one student from each county was selected. Sophie was thrilled. But Ruby had also applied and had not been selected. After that, Sophie said Ruby stopped talking to her, would walk past her in the hallways without acknowledging her. Did Sophie seem afraid of Ruby? Grace's voice broke. The week before she died, Sophie told me Ruby had been sending her strange messages, taunting her. Sophie said she was worried, but she thought maybe Ruby just needed time to cool off. The testimony was devastating. Voss tried to suggest that Grace's memory might be influenced by grief, but Grace was firm. Sophie had been afraid, and Ruby had given her good reason to be. The prosecution built its case methodically over the following days. They called classmates who testified about Ruby's jealousy over the scholarship. One student, a girl named Emma Watts, described an incident in the cafeteria 2 weeks before Sophie's death. Ruby was sitting with a group of us, Emma said, and someone congratulated Sophie on the scholarship. Ruby's face just changed. She got this look, like pure hatred. And then she said, loud enough for Sophie to hear, "I do not lose to anyone." Another classmate testified about Ruby's behavior after Sophie's death. A boy named Tyler Brooks said he had seen Ruby in the hallway the day after Sophie died, talking to friends. She was crying, Tyler said, but then someone walked past and she stopped crying immediately. And I heard her say to her friend, "Guess I win now." Then she saw me watching and started crying again. The testimony painted a picture of a girl who was not grieving, but performing grief, while secretly celebrating her rival's death. Then came the digital evidence. Detective Lorna Price took the stand and described the investigation in meticulous detail. She explained finding Ruby at the scene, the initial interview, the request for Ruby's phone. And then she described what forensic analysis had revealed. "Detective Price," Finn asked, "what did you find when you examined the defendant's phone?" Price pulled out a thick folder of documentation. "We found that a large number of text messages had been deleted from the device approximately 15 minutes after Sophie Chen's death. The deletion occurred at 4:37 in the afternoon. The 911 call reporting Sophie's death was placed at 4:22. That means Ruby deleted these messages while she was still at the scene, before police arrived. Why is that significant? Because it suggests consciousness of guilt. If Ruby truly believed this was an accident, if she were genuinely traumatized, why would her first priority be deleting text messages from her phone? The question hung in the air. Several jurors looked at Ruby, who kept her eyes down, her tissue pressed to her face. "Detective Price, were you able to recover these deleted messages?" "Yes." Ruby's phone had automatic cloud backup enabled. The messages she deleted had already been backed up to the cloud server earlier that day. We obtained a warrant for access to that backup and were able to recover the deleted messages in their entirety. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Judge Harron called for silence. Finn continued. "How many messages were recovered?" 47 text messages sent by Ruby in the 3 days before Sophie's death, and 8 messages sent on the day of Sophie's death before the incident occurred. What was the content of these messages? Price's expression hardened. The messages showed that Ruby had planned the confrontation with Sophie. She had invited Sophie to meet behind the gymnasium after school. She had described to friends what she planned to do, and in messages sent the morning of Sophie's death, she discussed how she would respond when police questioned her. Voss objected strenuously, arguing that Price was characterizing evidence rather than presenting facts. Judge Harron sustained the objection, but allowed Price to continue with specific examples. Finn introduced the messages one by one, each one more damning than the last. A message to a friend 3 days before Sophie's death read, "She thinks we will be friends again tonight." A message sent the morning of Sophie's death said, I will make it look like an accident. Smile later, cry now. With each message entered into evidence, Ruby's composure slipped a little more. Her hand holding the tissue began to shake. She whispered to Voss, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. This is out of context. They do not understand how we talked. But the jury was understanding perfectly. The most damaging evidence came from the forensic analyst who had recovered the messages. His name was David Chen, no relation to the victim, a specialist in digital forensics who had worked for the Oregon State Police for 12 years. He explained the technical process of recovery in detail, walking the jury through how cloud backups worked, how deleted data could be retrieved, how metadata could verify authenticity. Mr. Chen, Finn asked, were you able to verify that these messages were actually sent by the defendant? Yes. Each message contains metadata that includes the sender's phone number, the recipient's phone number, and a timestamp. All of the recovered messages were sent from Ruby French's phone number. Additionally, we verified the deletion commands. The deletion occurred from Ruby's device at 4:37 in the afternoon on March 24th, exactly 15 minutes after Sophie Chen's death. Is it possible these messages were fabricated or altered? No. The metadata and backup logs are cryptographically sealed. Any alteration would be immediately detectable. These messages are authentic. Voss tried desperately to create doubt during cross-examination. She suggested that Ruby's phone could have been hacked, that someone else could have sent the messages. But Chen dismantled each suggestion with technical precision. The evidence was irrefutable. During a recess, Voss pulled Ruby into the consultation room. Her expression was grim. Ruby, the text messages are destroying us. The jury is not buying your story anymore. Ruby's mask slipped completely for a moment, revealing cold anger beneath. Half the kids at school delete texts. Why am I being persecuted for normal behavior? Voss leaned forward, her voice sharp. Because you deleted messages about planning a murder 15 minutes after committing that murder. That is not normal behavior, Ruby. That is evidence of guilt. Ruby crossed her arms, her jaw set. I did not murder anyone. Sophie attacked me and I defended myself. The texts were they were jokes, dark humor.
Everyone talks like that.
Voss sat back, exhausted. I have defended a lot of clients, Ruby, and I can tell when someone is lying to me. The question is whether you are lying to yourself, too. Ruby said nothing. She simply turned away and stared at the wall, her performance abandoned in private, revealing the cold calculation beneath. The case moved into its second week. The prosecution continued to build its timeline. They presented GPS data from Ruby's phone showing she had been at the location behind the gymnasium for 43 minutes before Sophie arrived, suggesting premeditation rather than a chance encounter. They presented photographs from Ruby's phone showing she had been taking selfies in the hours after Sophie's death, smiling and posing as if nothing had happened. A teacher from Pinecreek High School testified about Ruby's character. The teacher, a woman named Helen Briggs, who had taught both Ruby and Sophie, described Ruby as highly intelligent but manipulative. She has a way of saying things that sound innocent but are actually quite cruel, Briggs said. She once told me, everyone forgives a pretty girl. That is how she sees the world. Ruby actually smiled when that testimony was presented, as if it were a compliment rather than an indictment. The prosecution called the students who had received Ruby's deleted text messages. One by one, they took the stand and described the messages they had received. A girl named Chloe Martin testified that Ruby had sent her a message the night before Sophie's death saying, "Tomorrow is going to be interesting. Watch the news." Another student, a boy named Derek Foster, testified that Ruby had sent him a message 2 hours after Sophie's death saying, "Can you believe what happened? So tragic," with a series of crying face emojis. But then she had followed up with a message she thought she had deleted. "Cannot wait to see their faces." The cumulative weight of the testimony was crushing. Ruby's story of a tragic accident was crumbling under the mountain of evidence showing planning, execution, and celebration. Then came the final piece of evidence. The prosecution announced they had one more witness, one more exhibit that would seal Ruby's fate. Finn stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the state calls Detective Lorna Price to authenticate our final piece of evidence." Price returned to the stand, her expression grave. Finn asked her about the process of recovering the deleted messages, the verification of their authenticity, the chain of custody. Then he asked the critical question. "Detective Price, among the messages you recovered, was there one particular message that stood out to you as especially significant?" Price nodded. "Yes, a message sent by Ruby to a friend named Madison Taylor at 4:52 in the afternoon on the day Sophie died. That was 25 minutes after police arrived on scene. Ruby sent it while she was still being interviewed by officers. What did that message say?" Price pulled out a printed copy. It said, "They will all believe me," followed by a smiley face emoji. The courtroom went completely silent. The message was a confession in itself, not of the act, but of the manipulation that followed. Finn turned to Judge Harron. "Your Honor, at this time the state would like to present Exhibit 32, the complete archive of recovered deleted messages. We request that the court read selected messages into the record." Voss objected, arguing that it was prejudicial to have the judge read them. But Judge Harron overruled. "These are authenticated exhibits properly entered into evidence. The jury has a right to hear them in full." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harron put on her reading glasses and began to read from the transcript of Ruby's deleted messages. Her voice was steady but cold, each word landing like a stone. Message sent March 21st at 9:43 in the evening. From Ruby French to Madison Taylor. Quote, "She thinks we will be friends again tonight." End quote. Message sent March 22nd at 7:15 in the morning. From Ruby French to Derek Foster. Quote, "I do not lose to anyone. She is going to learn that." End quote. Message sent March 24th at 11:32 in the morning, the day of Sophie's death. From Ruby French to Madison Taylor. Quote, "I will make it look like an accident. Smile later, cry now." End quote. With each message, Ruby's face grew paler. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. The mask she had worn so carefully throughout the trial was cracking, shattering under the weight of her own words. Judge Harron continued, relentless. Message sent March 24th at 4:52 in the afternoon, 25 minutes after police arrived. From Ruby French to Madison Taylor. Quote, "They will all believe me." Smiley face. End quote. Judge Harron set down the transcript and looked directly at Ruby. "These messages belong to the truth, Miss French, not to memory." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Ruby sat frozen, her performance completely destroyed. Her father, sitting in the gallery, lowered his head into his hands. Her mother stared straight ahead, tears streaming down her face. Finn remained standing. "Your Honor, the state rests." Voss sat motionless for a long moment. Then she stood slowly. "The defense rests as well." There was no point in calling witnesses. No testimony could explain away what the jury had just heard. Ruby's own words had convicted her. Closing arguments were brief. Finn reminded the jury of everything they had seen and heard. The medical evidence showing this was not an accident. The witness testimony showing Ruby's jealousy and rage. And most importantly, the deleted text messages showing premeditation, planning, and a complete lack of remorse. Ruby French planned Sophie Chen's murder, Finn said, his voice rising. She lured Sophie to a remote location, she attacked her, she bashed her head against the concrete, and then, while Sophie lay dying, Ruby began deleting evidence. She was not in shock, she was not traumatized, she was covering her tracks. And when police arrived, she put on the performance of her life. Finn gestured toward Ruby. But performances eventually end, and when the curtain falls, all that remains is the truth. The truth that Ruby French is a murderer who thought she was too smart, too charming, too pretty to be held accountable. But she was wrong. Voss did her best. She argued that the messages were jokes, that teenage girls talk dramatically, that the deletion was innocent. But her words fell flat. The jury had heard Ruby's messages. They had seen the timeline. They knew. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict. Guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. Ruby sat completely still as the verdict was read. The smirk that had been her default expression throughout the trial was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. Her performance had failed, and for the first time in her life, Ruby French could not talk her way out of consequences. Judge Harron scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. Ruby was remanded to custody without bail. The day of sentencing arrived. The courtroom was once again filled to capacity. Ruby entered in her orange jumpsuit, the silver necklace gone, her hair pulled back severely. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. She kept her eyes down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Judge Harron allowed victim impact statements. Grace Chen approached the podium slowly, supported by her husband. She spoke in a voice that trembled with grief and rage. Ruby French killed my daughter. She planned it, she executed it, she celebrated it, and then she tried to hide it. Grace paused, composing herself. But what haunts me most is not just that she killed Sophie. It is that she typed her pride into the crime. She turned Sophie's last day into content for her friends. She mocked our grief. She turned murder into performance art. Grace looked directly at Ruby. You deleted those messages, Ruby. But the deletions did not hide them. They preserved them. They showed us exactly who you are. A girl who values winning more than human life. She returned to her seat, her husband holding her as she wept. Then Judge Harron spoke. She removed her glasses and set them on the bench, her gaze fixed on Ruby with absolute clarity. Miss French, for weeks this court has watched you perform. We have watched you cry on cue. We have watched you touch that necklace as if it were a symbol of your grief rather than a prop in your theatre. We have watched you smile faintly to the cameras and whisper your scripted sadness within range of microphones. Ruby looked up, her eyes red but dry. Judge Harron continued, her voice hard and unyielding. But these messages are your true script, Miss French. The one no jury can forget. When you thought no one was watching, when you thought your words would be erased, you told the truth. You planned this murder. You anticipated the aftermath. You looked forward to manipulating sympathy, and you were excited about it. The judge leaned forward. You wrote that Sophie thought you would be friends again. You wrote that you would make it look like an accident. You wrote that you would cry later but smile now. Those are not jokes. Those are not teenage exaggeration. Those are the words of someone who understood exactly what they were planning to do. Judge Harron's voice rose. After you killed Sophie, while you were still at the scene, while her body was still warm, you deleted those messages. You were not in shock. You were not traumatized. You were executing the final step of your plan, covering your tracks. And then you put on the performance of your life. Ruby's shoulders began to shake. Tears streamed down her face, but these were not the practiced tears of before. These were tears of exposure, of having her mask ripped away in front of everyone. The judge was relentless. You told investigators this was self-defense, that Sophie attacked you and you pushed her away, but the evidence told a different story. The medical evidence showed Sophie was thrown to the ground with significant force. The text messages showed you had planned exactly that. And your message, sent while police were interviewing you, "They will all believe me," with a smiley face, showed that you knew you were lying and you thought you would get away with it. Judge Harron sat back, her expression one of profound disgust. You are 17 years old. Some would argue that you deserve leniency because of your youth. But the evidence shows a level of premeditation and manipulation that is chilling, regardless of age. You did not act impulsively. You did not lose control. You planned Sophie's murder. You executed that plan. And then you tried to manipulate everyone around you into believing you were the victim. She picked up the sentencing document. Manipulation is not innocence, Miss French. It is cruelty wearing a smile. And you have demonstrated a level of cruelty that demands the maximum penalty allowed by law. Judge Harron read from the document. This court sentences you to 40 years to life in the custody of the Oregon Department of Corrections. You will be held in a juvenile facility until you reach the age of 21, at which point you will be transferred to an adult correctional facility. You will be eligible for parole after serving 30 years. She set down the paper and looked at Ruby one final time. You thought memory could be edited, Miss French. You thought that by deleting those messages, you could erase the truth. But truth is permanent ink. It cannot be erased. It cannot be edited. It remains, no matter how hard you try to delete it. Judge Harron brought down the gavel. This court is adjourned. Ruby was led away by bailiffs, her orange jumpsuit vivid against the wood paneling of the courtroom. As she walked toward the side door, her own deleted messages still glowed on the screens positioned around the courtroom for the jury. The final message was magnified, larger than the others. I always win. But Ruby had not won. She had lost everything. In the weeks that followed, the case became a catalyst for legislative change. Oregon lawmakers introduced the Digital Honesty Act, a bill that would require automatic forensic retention of deletion logs in major criminal offenses. The bill passed unanimously and was signed into law 6 months later. Sophie's family established a foundation in her name, supporting programs that helped young people deal with jealousy and competitive pressure in healthy ways. The response was overwhelming, with donations pouring in from across the state. Ruby was transferred to a secure juvenile facility in eastern Oregon. She was placed in intensive therapy, subjected to psychological evaluations, monitored constantly. The doctors who examined her diagnosed her with narcissistic personality disorder and a profound lack of empathy. The prognosis for rehabilitation was poor. Detective Price kept a photograph of Sophie Chen on her desk, a school picture showing a smiling girl with bright eyes and an easy confidence. The case had affected her deeply. The calculated nature of the crime, the youth of both victim and perpetrator, the chilling coldness of those deleted messages. Marcus Finn moved on to other cases, but the French trial remained one of his most significant. He had proven that digital evidence could overcome even the most compelling performance, that truth could be recovered even when someone tried to delete it. And Judge Harron, in her chambers after the sentencing, sat alone for a long time. She thought about Ruby's face when the messages had been read aloud, the moment her mask had cracked and real fear had shown through. She thought about Sophie, a girl whose life had been stolen by someone she considered a friend. She thought about Grace Chen's words. The deletions did not hide them. They preserved them. Justice had been served. The truth had been spoken. But there was no satisfaction in it. Only the terrible knowledge that a 17-year-old girl had been capable of such calculated cruelty, and that her only regret was getting caught. The deleted messages remained in the evidence files, preserved forever in digital form. They would be studied by law enforcement, used as training materials for digital forensics experts, cited in legal journals. Ruby French had wanted to be remembered, and she would be. Not as the clever girl who got away with murder, but as the defendant whose own words had destroyed her. The final image that haunted everyone who had been in that courtroom was not of Ruby being led away in handcuffs. It was of her final text message, still glowing on the courtroom screens, even after she was gone. I always win. The words mocked her now, a permanent reminder that arrogance and intelligence without conscience would always, eventually, destroy themselves. Ruby French had thought she could delete the truth. Instead, she had preserved it forever.